The story about HudBay Minerals and nickel mining is just one story. Someone could come here and talk about Barrick Gold and many of the issues around the country with Barrick Gold. We could talk about Gold Corp in Guatemala or Honduras, where we work a lot, or in other countries. The point one major point I'd leave with everyone tonight is this is a systemic, industry-wide issue, and it's a Canadian policy issue. And that the HudBay story is just one story. And I'm not an expert in the mining industry, but I don't see how HudBay is any better or any worse than many other companies out there. It's acting in a very similar way to the way many companies operate around the world, and that a wide range of health and environmental harms and a wide range of human rights violations are occurring systemically where they're operating, just as a natural course of events. These things are not surprising, they're absolutely predictable. And so HudBay's story is just one story. The comments, but this is Adolfo Ish. This is the man we'll be talking about. He was killed on September the 27th, 2009. And this is the issue we'll be talking about. In 2010, it's called Paradise Lost. This is a really well-done documentary by CTV's W5, and it covers Goldcorp's mine in Guatemala and the nickel mining story. And it directly covers the killing of Adolfo Ish and Angelica Choc, who Cory's firm is representing. She is in this film, as well as her son is. This is a very good piece, and thankfully it went out on mainstream Canadian television. Yes. So this is not a Guatemalan story that we'll be talking about tonight. It's a mining story, which is a global issue, and it's taking place in a place called Guatemala this time. We could give another talk about Pacific Rim in El Salvador, or Canadian companies in the Congo, etc. There's a lot of patterns that repeat themselves. So this is very much a Canadian issue that we're talking about. It's not a Guatemalan issue. Amen. Neither Rights Action as an organization or me, Grahame, or anti-mining semantics, but Rights Action is a group that works in favor of community-controlled development, in favor of environmental well-being and defense of the conservation, and in favor of human rights. That most of these issues are local to global at the same time. I've already made that point, I just reiterate it. This is not a Guatemalan story, it's not a Canadian story, it's a global story. It's a global industry, and it must be dealt with critically at all levels, in Canada, at the international level, and inside Guatemala. On these mining-related stories, you get a very, if not depressing, but a complex overlapping of environmental concerns, community development concerns, and human rights concerns all at the same time. It's not just that mining companies contribute to human rights violations and don't affect the environment or their development. Mining is having a devastating impact on communities and well-being across the board. It's wrecking watersheds, it's drying up water sources, it's contaminating water, it's contributing to health harms, it's violating people's rights when they organize to defend their communities, and it's undermining, pardon the pun, it's undermining local development. These communities where the companies are operating, in the case of nickel mining, incredibly poor communities, they need some good development policies. And mining is not bringing good development. It's bringing an unjust business model that's undermining their very chance to have healthy communities to live in and bring their children up in. Canadian government for years has, as policy, the spreading and encouraging of our companies and investors to go around the world and open up new markets for our companies and investors, not just in the mining industry, in many industries. That's what our government does. That's what our embassies do in these countries. And since the late 90s, we're just living, Latin America is living just sort of the most recent wave of massive expansion of mining companies coming in and setting up shop. It's a Canadian corporate issue, obviously. Canada's the mining capital of the world. Toronto Stock Exchange is like the number one stock exchange with respect to investing in mining and getting public funds to mining. Canada's a mining capital of the world. Most corporations are incorporated here or have subsidiaries here to take benefit of Canadian laws. And we have all kinds of laws in place that favor the incorporation of mining companies here and to encourage the expansion of mining interests around the world. It's deeply a Canadian issue on the investment side, because how we're all indirectly or directly benefiting from what sometimes can only be called unjust enrichment. In the last 2 or 3 years, an increased amount of critical attention, even in the mainstream media, on mining, and that's a good thing. And the CTV Lost Paradise piece that came out was very important and a good sign. But still, I think our media is behind the game with respect to on an ongoing basis, reporting critically on what Canadian mining companies are involved with around the world. It's profoundly a Canadian legal issue. And so whereas we have laws in place that promote the expansion of our mining companies and investments around the world and encourage it, promote it, and support it, there's an absolute refusal to bring into effect civil law reform or criminal law reform, so that we can at least have counterbalancing laws to hold our companies accountable in our courts if and when they contribute to harms and violations, etc. And we can come back to Bill C-300 and the debate in a second. There's just an absolute refusal to pass that legislation, and so it's an absolute double standard. So that's a generalization. I think that Canadian companies operate out of Canada with impunity and with immunity from prosecution, and then the case we hear about tonight becomes an exception to that, and it's a very important exception, trying to break through that wall of impunity and then immunity from prosecution. Obviously, Canadian mining companies are not responsible for Guatemala's long history of exploitation and repression and racism, etc. But once they choose to go and operate there and take advantage of those very conditions of corruption, lack of rule of law, lack of democracy, they assume the responsibility for their actions in the country, and they benefit from them. For the sake of the expansion of Canadian mining interests in Guatemala, the Canadian government and the US government, the mining companies themselves, the World Bank, which is was an investor in Goldcorp in Guatemala, all say that they're abiding by the democratic will of the people of Guatemala who elected these governments, and we're dealing government to government. And at the same time, they say we're abiding by the rule of law, i.e. we go in there and we abide by their laws. And this is absolute smoke and mirrors. And the Canadian and US governments know this, and the World Bank knows this, and our companies know this, that the democratic institutions in Guatemala are extremely weak on the best day and deeply corrupted on the worst days. When questioned, our companies and governments and the World Bank say, oh no, it's the democratic will of the people of Guatemala. It sounds good on paper. We abide by the rule of law, as if that's how the legal system works. They are not working. The mining story starts to pick up again seriously in Guatemala and throughout Central America in the mid to late 90s, while they're doing the so-called transition back to democracy. And concessions were given out all across Honduras, all across Guatemala, throughout El Salvador, unbeknownst to their own populations, because they were still engaged in the peace process and laying down their arms from these small rebel movements and trying to overcome the fear of the atrocities of the past. But the nickel mining story that we're going to be looking at today begins in the 1960s, and I want to give that brief history because the killing of Adolfo Isht is not a unique story. It's not a one-off killing. It's a repetitive pattern of repression that's happened again and again, even in this region of the country. There's no courts in Guatemala that the indigenous people of Guatemala can take their land claims issues to. But all of the land that has nickel concessions given out first to Inco and then to Sky Resources and HudBay, Mayan Kekchi people were living on that land for hundreds of years before they even arrived, and yet the land was sold out, I put that between quotation marks, by the regimes of the day. And so the companies would show up with a piece of paper saying we're the owner of the land, and meanwhile they're the indigenous people who've been living there for hundreds of years and generations saying we're here. And so there's a prior land claim issue that has never been resolved in any court anywhere, but this is also a fundamental underlying point. Obviously HudBay claims absolutely not. This is nonsense. Those are squatters. They're invaders of our land. We are the legal ownership of the land.